Hi, today I'd like to talk about ancient Rome, its rise, its transition from republic to empire, and finally its demise. You should access the PowerPoint that accompanies this video lecture and also make use of the textbook chapters. The textbook I've chosen does a very excellent job of talking about ancient Rome. So just to start off, when we talk about Rome, there are a few different topics to help us break it down into small pieces. We could talk first of all about the rise of Rome, which is literally just the city of Rome from around the year 800 BCE to about 30 BCE. This is the Roman city that's centered in Latium in central Italy. That's where the word Latin comes from. And how the Romans broke free from the Etruscans and established a city-state model of government, which then led to their social stability and rule of law, and eventually their enormous economic and military might. Another topic would be the Roman Republic. This is something that interested our founding fathers in American history. What about the Roman Republic? And when, Madison and all the other founding fathers are talking about, the ancient world and what can we learn from these people, they look to ancient Greece, they look to ancient Rome and the lessons that were learned. The concept of republic itself is worthy of study. A third topic is the transition from republic to empire. How did one system of government, the republic, transition to the imperial form of government, the empire? Imperial or empire, meaning that there is an emperor. So it's a major transition in terms of self-government. The period of the Roman peace, which goes from the year 30 to 235 BCE, is something the textbook talks about, and I will just dwell on that very briefly later on. But this is the period we're most used to thinking about when we think about ancient Rome, the ancient Roman Empire, the Roman peace, or Pax Romana as it was called. Then I want to talk about late antiquity. The empire in transition. Historians used to talk about the fall of the Roman Empire as if it just kind of toppled, like a building during an earthquake, or like Berlin fell in a matter of a couple of days at the end of World War II. The Roman Empire did not fall in that manner. So in what way did it fall? Historians increasingly over the last few decades have talked about late antiquity, more of a transition from Roman Empire into early medieval. So we'll look at late antiquity. The next topic is the three heirs to the Roman Empire. And this, of course, would be Byzantium in the east. This would be the Germanic kingdoms to the north, and finally, this would be the empire of Islam in the Mediterranean world. And so, in addition to the fall of Rome, I also want to talk about the persistence of the Roman ideal as we move into the Middle Ages. So there's a whole bunch of topics here. We won't have a chance to get into philosophy and literature of ancient Rome like we did with the ancient Greeks. So the origins of Rome are in Latium, like I said, and where we get our word Latin from, and they separated over the course of perhaps it was 100 years, maybe 200 years, from the Etruscans, about whom we know very, very little. And the Roman mythology, though, has lots of interesting stories of how Rome was founded, but we have to take these with a grain of salt. The city-state of Rome is something I want to talk about in terms of its political structure, which I'll do so momentarily. So I want to focus in on Rome circa 500 BCE up to the time of Julius Caesar, and then the beginnings of the empire. Again, I will refer you to your textbook to look on the origins of Rome. The Republic itself again, this is it's a form of government. And the word republic, which we talk about today, United States is a republic. It's a democratic republic. What does republic mean? We have the Republican Party. The republic actually is a combination of two words, res publica, the public thing. And we combine res publica, we get republic. It's a certain sense of civic participation, of civic virtue, of citizen participation that I think we can all identify. Romans today would probably not understand how Americans today would choose not to vote or not to be involved. They would think not only is it just a privilege and important, but they would think that they couldn't imagine their citizenship apart from being a participant in the process. I'll get more specific momentarily on the number of assemblies they had. So res publica, the public thing, we get our word republic from that. It's a slowly evolving form of government. I want to say one thing about this. The textbook will fill you in on details. It was a response to slowly evolving crises. It wasn't the fact that somebody woke up one morning and said, hey, let's create a republic. The republic was a solution to a series of rather short-term problems. What we ended up with was the Roman Republic, which became a model of government unlike anything we've seen in the ancient world. Athens, of course, had the city-state that we talked about. It gave us democracy, the rule of the demos. But with Rome, we see a huge expansion of this idea of civic participation. Socially, people in the Republic were broken down into patricians and plebeians. And like many places in the ancient world, it was basically a male-centered society. The patricians were the elite of Rome. And the aristocrats, if you will, although not necessarily in a formal sense, although that does happen eventually. We get our word patricia from that, and Patrick comes from that. Patriarchal, so patrician, the patricians, these are people who are the elites. They, much like the eupatrids, in ancient Athens, they are the well-fathered ones, the ones whose family goes back generations and generations and have always had money and political influence. And we can contrast the patricians with the plebeians. Plebeian means common. It doesn't mean poor. It doesn't mean, a peasant. It means common. If you're not a patrician, well, then you must be a plebeian. Of course, there also were slaves. That's a whole other classification. But plebeians were the common folk. They could not trace their ancestry back to some great family, from a couple hundred years ago. So sociologically, we see these two different factors at work here. And a lot of what happens in the Roman Republic is a balancing of these two social forces. The dominant assembly at this time is called the Senate, which comes from the Latin senex, which literally means old men. And if you look at our U.S. Senate today, there are men and women in there, and there are some younger and older. But historically, the American Senate has been populated by very old men. So, and I mean that not pejoratively, but just as an observation. Well, this was the case by design in ancient Rome. Senex were those people who were older and who had participated in government in various ways. And then once they left their other government role, they move into this other dimension here as members of the Roman Senate. The last thing to mention about the Republic is that they were constantly at war. And it's through war that they acquired territories around them. In the Italian Peninsula, it was later to be called the Italian Peninsula, and eventually around the Mediterranean world. As far as this foreign policy is concerned, Rome was always concerned about its neighbors possibly attacking it, so they thought the best strategy was a preemptive strike. So we'll attack them first before they attack us, and that becomes the beginning of this aggrandizement of the size of the Roman Republic. If you're having this kind of foreign policy, you need to have a large army. More people are needed to fight than ever before. And so you recruit citizens, literally going from pushing a plow one day to wielding a sword the next day, you know? So these people are needed to fight, and they expect something in return for their public military service. Like veterans today who participate in keeping our country secure. You know, veterans get certain benefits, you know, to take college courses and so forth. In the same way, people expected something in return, whether it was land, whether it was political influence, you know, voter participation, that kind of thing. We see the first, public posting of Roman law in the so-called 12 tables. And this spells out the duties and responsibilities for everybody. But we also see the development of various councils and assemblies. I want to talk about one, and that is the plebeian council. The plebeian council is the council of those people who are plebeians. And in the beginnings, they did not have control over anything else other than plebeian affairs. Gradually, they had the authority to veto certain things, and eventually, by 287 BCE, they had full legislative power. So we see the growth of this socioeconomic group called the plebeians growing at the height of the Republic. The government itself, I have a PowerPoint on this. I do not expect you to know all these things, but there are a variety of magistrates that occupy different levels in the bureaucracy. We had council. Actually, you had two councils that would kind of be the head of the government. You had praetors, quaestors, aediles, tribunes, and censors. So a lot of these positions came with a lot of authority, and as a lot of these people retired or moved on, they would move into the Senate. The point I'm trying to emphasize here is that the Roman Republic was functioning like a well-oiled machine with lots of citizen participation and with experienced bureaucrats moving into the role of senators later in their careers. I mentioned the many assemblies. Some of the voting assemblies were the Curia Assembly. I mentioned earlier the Plebeian Assembly. The Senate itself, which was originally patrician and gradually expanded its membership to others as well. There were tribal assemblies. Tribe here means a different thing than what we think of. It was organized by kind of like a geographical district, maybe kind of like a county or a voting district is today. There were 4 districts. In Rome, 29 in the countryside. Finally, we have the Century Assembly, which we're not quite sure on the root of the word century, but it means 100. Every Roman citizen was a member of a tribe, which means he was a member of a district and voted in an assembly, and also a member of a century as well. So lots and lots of opportunities for people to participate in government, either directly or through the representative. And this goes to the heart of this concept of res publica, the public thing, you know. So how the Republic worked in actuality, as apart from this schema I've developed, well, there was an emphasis on age. You know, the older people are more experienced, they should be given consideration, hence the Senate being old men. They emphasized experience. Have you done this before? You know, if you were a praetor or or an aedile, maybe you would go into the Senate. You know, had you had military experience? You know, what is your background? And finally, they emphasized tradition. They kept asking themselves, what would our ancestors have done? We want to maintain this political tradition. It's not unlike today when people say, what would our founding fathers say about this? What would Jefferson or Madison, say about this particular political topic today? So it was a political system with lots of patron-client bonds. There was lots of political patronage. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It kind of actually creates a scenario for more social stability, political stability. And you did find a small number of powerful families. That seems to happen everywhere in the world, doesn't it? Where a certain number of families, rise to the top. Rome was no different than that. So there were some families who had greater control, greater power than others. But their focus on customs and this inherited authority, very, very important to understand how it operated. If you look at the map of Rome around 100 Common Era, 100 AD, you'll see that it was now a Mediterranean world. We started the semester by talking about the Eastern world in the Mediterranean, Mesopotamia, and then Greece. We said how that was moving to become a Mediterranean world, and after Rome, it moves up to become a European world. So the Roman Empire is actually a Mediterranean world. So we need to keep that in mind, especially if we're starting to talk about things like early Christianity and what comes after ancient Rome. Now, the transition from republic to empire is important, but I want to make one point first. We can speak of Rome as an empire in two different ways, in two different senses. In terms of size and expansion, Rome had acquired provinces all over the Mediterranean world, even when it was a republic. To that extent, it was sort of an empire. If you conquer these people and they pay you tribute, then that's an empire. People today will talk about the American Empire in the late 20th century. It's not really an empire. Doesn't have an emperor in charge, but they had economic control. Political leaders and corporations. So, in this first sense, Rome was already an empire in terms of its geographical power. In the second sense of the word empire, we mean an entity that's ruled by an emperor, okay? It's a type of rule. And here, this is a regime that's held by an emperor, in which power is held by an emperor, and it's a formal arrangement. And this begins with Augustus, and we need to see how that happens. So when we talk about the transition from republic to empire, we need to keep in mind that Rome was already huge and vast. It was an empire in that sense. But we're talking here specifically about the political structure, empire in terms of the political entity being headed by an emperor, and of course that means a diminishment of the role of the legislative assemblies. Well, there are some reasons why this happens, and I'm just going to give you a few of them. The textbook talks about a few as well. The consequences of empire, in the first sense of the word, is that the city-state had to be adapted. What worked well for Rome in the middle of Latium, 500 BCE, may not work 400 years later in terms of government when Rome has all these conquered territories around the Mediterranean. You can't have a city-state form of government when you've got a huge territory that needs to be ruled. War also means prestige and wealth, not only for generals, but also for other people who are outside the traditional social order. We see people emerging now who are generals who do not come from patrician families necessarily. They want to have their seat at the table to make decisions. Being constantly at war meant that you needed to have almost a permanent army. And this means the end of the Roman idea of the citizen soldier, where you fight a few wars and you go back to your farm and you plow your fields for a few more years. As Rome needed a more permanent army, the citizen soldier ideal diminishes. And finally, veteran soldiers who return home from the wars become a disruptive force in politics because they tend to vote for the generals. Who do they know best? Well, I was with this general in this campaign, so I'm going to vote for him for public office. So you could say that it engages in terms of stability, but actually was more of an unstable influence here. It's disruptive force because no longer are we asking the old questions about what would our ancestors have done, what would the patricians have done, or even what's the plebeian council telling us to do. We're now looking for what the generals want to do. So Rome, which has seen peace within its borders for so long, begins to become politically factionalized. Okay, it breaks into factions. We see an outgrowth here of political violence. I'm not going to get into the details. The textbook talks about that. I'm not going to ask you for specifics on this at all. On top of all this, the Roman armies begin to struggle in some of their military campaigns. As good as the Roman armies are, they began to butt heads against some very powerful forces. All of these factors, help contribute to this. So what happens? Opportunities presented by empire had destroyed the old political system. It was based on tradition, power, influence, and wealth. Could be won in the empire, and then could be deployed back in Rome with no checks and balances, which the old system, was much about the checks and balances. People got used to political violence, assassinations, armed uprisings. And finally, disruptions in the countryside led to a large number of landless people who had no commitment to the old values of ancient Rome. Remember how much time we're talking about here. We're talking about several hundreds of years. So it's like today in 2020 talking about what happened in the early 1700s or even earlier. The lesson that some people take away from this is just get your hands on an army, develop a reputation, and you too can be a mover and a shaker, a big leader in this new Roman Empire. There are three people who figure into what's called the first triumvirate, rule of three here: Pompey, Caesar, and Crassus. I'm not going to say much about Crassus, but Caesar, I will say something about. Caesar's command in Gaul, the area which today is pretty much what we call France, comes to an end in 49 BCE. The Senate orders him to disband his army and to return to Rome. And this is still the empire. This is still the Roman Republic, right? And here's a dilemma that Caesar faces. If he lays down his command, literally puts down his sword, leaves his soldiers here and says goodbye, crosses the Rubicon River as a private citizen, his enemies will destroy him once he gets to Rome. They'll kill him, quite literally. However, if he crosses the Rubicon with his army, then he has declared war on Rome, and particularly the Senate, and on Pompey. So what to do? You might hear the phrase, crossing the Rubicon. That means making in one's life a very decisive decision. There's no turning back. Well, Caesar, as you all know, crosses the Rubicon with his army in 49 BCE, and Roman history is changed as a result of that. But this is not the beginning of the empire just yet. Caesar defeats Pompey and returns to Rome in 46 BCE. At this point, it's probably worth asking the question, what kind of a ruler was Caesar? Was he a dictator or was he an enlightened ruler? Well, you could make a case for either position. He was a dictator, but he was enlightened. He implemented a variety of reforms that were good. Strong leaders who function in a sort of anti-democratic manner aren't necessarily bad if they're benevolent and they do good reforms. Everybody was looking for a solution to the collapse of the older Roman system. Caesar offered one way forward. He was killed and then followed by 13 years of civil war. Again, Rome is getting used to this armed conflict. There's a second triumvirate: Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus. Finally, Octavian defeats Antony in 31 BC in a decisive naval battle. Octavian, he's the key player here, he turns a military dictatorship, which is what he is now, having defeated Antony, into a legitimate monarchy. This is the beginning of the Roman imperial system. The Senate confers on him a new title, Augustus, revered one. We get our month August from that phrase, actually. He rules under this name of Augustus, Caesar Augustus. And he becomes what's known as first citizen, princeps. It's on the PowerPoint slide here. We get our word prince from that. Prince as being someone who's in line to be king. The first citizen, equal, the first among equals. That's that kind of an idea. The Augustan settlement in 27 BCE brings peace and security and order to the Roman Empire, which it hasn't had for many decades. and that's a good thing. And it stays peaceful and secure and orderly for the next couple hundred years. We call this time of this period of time Pax Romana, which goes basically from 30 BCE to about 180 CE, Common Era. So about 210 years before things start to unravel. That's not a small, insignificant amount of time. It does mean the end of Roman expansion. There's a couple of exceptions. They take some territory in Britain, some territory in Romania. But that marks the end of the expansion of the Roman territory as an empire. And now we can talk about the Roman Empire in both senses of the word, something that controls the entire Mediterranean world, much of the European world, soon to be European world, and also an empire in the sense of it's being ruled by an emperor. There's no return to chaos. There's a partnership between the Senate and the emperor. It's not that the Senate didn't have any power, but they are less willing to go their own way. And there's an understanding that an army will make and unmake an emperor. And that's a lesson that's going to be learned by other people later on. There's a crisis of the 3rd century. This is the year 200s. And the textbook will talk about the crises, and I'm not going to get into the specifics. They're economic, and they're military, and they're political. There's a whole bunch of explanations for that. We see two emperors who tried to implement reforms. Diocletian and Constantine did not do nothing. They tried to implement reforms, and they worked a little bit, but not enough. By this time period, though, Rome had become an armed camp. The Roman Empire had become an armed camp. Once again, kind of devolving to generals with strong armies. So we see Constantine taking a leading role here. I'll talk more about Constantine in terms of the beginnings of Christianity. When he converts, becomes a Christian, and decides that Christianity can live side by side with the Roman Empire, that marks a significant step in the evolution of Western civilization. We see a dividing of the empire into East and West. Theodosius dies in 395. He leaves the empire to two sons, one in the East, one in the West. And going forward from this time period, we're going to see an Eastern Empire and a Western Empire. Constantine had decided that he would create a city in the East. He called it Constantinople. So then we have Rome over on the western side. So we're going to see two, bases of power right now, an Eastern Empire and a Western Empire. And this becomes extremely important as we move through the next couple of centuries, and we see the gradual unraveling of the empire in the West. We see Germanic invasions bursting into Europe, the barbarians, around 370. So we find bit by bit a slow unraveling of the Roman Empire. On another note, I want to mention what also is going on, and that's the rise of Christianity. Christianity is a very, very important development. We'll turn to that in another PowerPoint, another video lecture. And we need to look at the fall of the Roman Empire in this period of late antiquity. Thank you very much.